if you are totally committed to one of these two ideologies, and you really don't want to accept any part of the narrative of the other, then this is not a discussion for you. You think that eventually you will rule, and you can rule, and you will have the power to negate the other totally. I think this is a discussion for those who genuinely care about peace, genuinely care about human beings, who are open to new ideas and new discussions, and who are willing to in some way accommodate the other rather than negate and totally disenfranchise the other in their way of doing things. I again think that both movements are in crisis right now, and that this is a good time for people to start thinking out of the box and to start moving beyond the current impasse.
Yes.
These are three questions. I'll start with the first one. Why would anybody agree to give up their privileges? Why would slave owners agree to an end to slavery? Why would the South Africans agree to end apartheid? Why would any ruling body choose to give up their privileges? And the answer is there's no good reason unless they are forced by either internal or external reasons to do so. So that's a legitimate argument, and but it reframes the struggle. Instead of a struggle between these two communities for their own, each for their own narrative and for their own power and privileges, it's the question is, why should people of goodwill ever want to live in peace rather than in domination? And I would argue that there are good reasons for that, and then that history or God or fate generally moves in the direction of greater rights, equality, and justice than otherwise. There are models that we can look at. There are instances in history where things have in fact happened. You mentioned Northern Ireland. That is certainly one possibility. I mentioned South Africa, the end of apartheid, how whites continue today to be powerful, in fact, dominant in certain sectors of the life and the economy, while they are numerically no longer the dominant party in politics. They continue to be powerful. So the one person, one vote democratic structure does not mean that 51% will always be dominant, and anybody who is a minority will always be oppressed or discriminated against. It's not automatic. It doesn't happen. It's not a silver bullet that completely slays the evil forces and gives justice immediately. It is a vision that we can work towards, and that we can work towards in confidence. It is not a fantasy. It is a real vision that can in fact work. The last question is, have I persuaded anybody in power yet of this? Well, the book just came out. I can only tell you that thoughtful people on both sides, Palestinians and Israelis, considering the crisis that we are in, have sort of made some noises in that direction, have thought about, well, can we do this differently? Because certainly the current paradigm is not working. Certainly it is not working. For Palestinians, it is not working, and I would argue that for Israelis, it is not working. It is now artificially sustained by massive support from the outside. I would argue that Israel is in a far weaker position to go its own way and to have an isolationist policy than South Africa ever was. Israel is totally dependent on the outside world, considers itself to be part of Europe, considers itself to be Western. They can't even do sports or culture or academic life, much less economic life without the rest of the world. They're just too small a country, too narrow, and too dependent on the outside. The fact that the United States has chosen to enable it to ignore the rest of the world, the International Criminal Court, the Security Council of the United Nations, and basically the opinion of decent people worldwide is the current state of affairs. But I would argue it is not a permanent and it's not a sustainable state of affairs. Uh, Actually, I would go even beyond that. I started my speech by saying that these two movements are mutually exclusive. They are totally contrary to each other. Even if the PLO removes this from its charter, which by the way it did, is not enough. Because at its very roots, Palestinians think that this is Arab and that the Zionist movement is illegitimate and illegal. And I started by acknowledging that. And I say that it's not enough to change the charter. I want to change the mentality. I want my Palestinian friends to recognize that even if they had full liberation tomorrow, half the people living in their Palestine are not Arab, are Jewish, and they're going nowhere. So you can't have Palestine Arabiya if you have 7 million non-Arabs living there. So you need to change Palestinian nationalism to accept and accommodate those Jewish Israelis who are already living in Palestine. That's way beyond just changing the charter. It's a more fundamental change that I am requiring of the Palestinian people. But I'm also requiring the same of the Zionists. A fundamental acceptance at a deep level that this is not Jewish only, that this is both Jewish and Arab. For Jewish Israelis, I say your state cannot be exclusively Jewish because half the people living in it today are not Jews. And you have not succeeded to ethnically cleanse this place, neither should you be allowed to. And you cannot live as a dominant, ruling apartheid regime where Jews dominate non-Jews in historic Palestine, whether it's in the 67 occupied areas or in Israel itself. You cannot say this is the nation state of the Jews only, and only Jews have the right of self-determination in this land. So what I'm calling for is a much more radical thing that you are proposing. Change your charter. We've changed the charter. So what? What has that done? I am calling for a much more radical position. I used to always answer that question, does Israel have the right to exist? Yes, of course it does. I don't anymore, because I don't think that states as such have the right to exist. I think people have the right to exist, and people have the right to thrive, and people have the right to be satisfied. And while documents are very important, and one of the critiques of my vision is that it relies a little bit too much on constitutions and written documents and provisions. What I am calling for, I think, is a much more serious and radical change than just removing an article from your charter. Okay, if organizers allow me to respond to that, it's very interesting, because in Israel, Palestinians are allowed to vote to the Knesset, but they have zero political power, because the structure of Israeli government since its creation was that it always has coalition governments. Even the two largest parties together cannot form a government. So you always need a coalition. And it's been an almost unstated rule that no coalition government will allow Arabs to be part of it. So Arab members of Knesset have been basically powerless since the creation of the state until today. In Arabic, when we were kids, we used to play soccer, and we'd get these little kids who want to join our team. So we call them empty peanuts, fustuk fadi, which means, yeah, you'll be part of our team, you'll run up and down the field, but nobody will pass the ball to you. And if you ever get the ball, sort of the game will cease until you pass it to somebody else, and then the game will resume. You are not part of the game. So Arab Israelis who constitute 20%, 22% of Israeli citizenry are being told, you are not part of the game. You are fustuk fadi. You are empty peanut shells. You will never be allowed. Even right now, when small, tiny parties play major role in formation of government, it's an unspoken rule that the Arabs will not be allowed to be part of that power sharing. In Palestine, in the West Bank, the Israelis have their own settlements, and the Arabs can't even physically enter those settlements. So it's not a question of do they allow Jews to worship in the West Bank. They control, they are in power. The Ibrahimi Mosque, for example, in Hebron, where the massacre took place, right now is physically shared by force by Israeli soldiers and policemen that require Arabs to allow Jews to worship there. 2 days ago, the first day of Ramadan in Jerusalem, they actually physically broke the locks, went in and cut the wires for the muezzin prayer so that they wouldn't pray, because that would be disturbing the Jews who were commemorating and praying on the other side. So Israel has the physical power throughout the occupied territories and in Israel to determine what happens. But, I really wanted to move beyond the kind of listing of grievances and victimhood. And in fact, most of the people who have read the book thought I was leaning over too much backwards to understand both sides and to accommodate both sides. If you want to stay within that paradigm of Israel versus Palestine, I can understand that. And I have nothing to say to you other than that it has failed. It hasn't worked. Where I am sovereign in my territory and I totally negate the other. But that's been the reality. And if you ask each side, the other side does not accommodate them sufficiently. I'm trying to create a new hybrid form that accommodates both sides. I've raised a whole number of issues, but I will just concentrate on the last one. I list the Jewish right of return as an essential part of what Zionists want in their state. I also list Haqq al-Awda, the right of return for Palestinian, as being an essential part of what they want. And I recognize both of them in the document that I want to establish. And it's a document that neither side can change. It becomes a constitutional document, without some kind of super majority. So that I talked once to a rabbi and said, you're a Zionist. You want a Jewish state. Why do you want a Jewish state? What does a Jewish state do for you? I mean, you can't circumcise a state. What is a Jewish state for you? And he said, he thought about it, and he said, I want a state where any Jew, anytime, no questions asked, can go and live and be able to defend himself. I said, maybe I can give you something better. How about a state where any Jew, anytime, no questions asked, can go and live where he doesn't need to defend himself because the world is not against him, because he's at peace, because he's at home, because Palestinians feel okay with him being there, and this is my dream and my vision. Because you can't claim a right of return after 2,000 years and deny the right of return for those who are actually born in Jerusalem and who want to return to it, and you say, no, you can't. See, I start with a recognition that these two movements are mutually exclusive. If you want the state to be Jewish, you have to keep out non-Jews and push out any non-Jews that you can. And if you say Palestine Arabiya, this is only for Arabs, you will oppose immigration. You will oppose Jews coming there, even if they are under duress and escaping from the Holocaust. And I want to move beyond that. I want the state to be open, both to Palestinians who want to return and to Jews who want to immigrate there. Again, no questions asked. As of constitutional right, they have the right to go there. One of the points that I try to make in the book, or one of the qualifications, is that I am not implying that there is any symmetry in the situation. I'm just avoiding the kind of discussions that are based on who is more of a victim and whose narrative is more correct than the other one. But I'm totally in sympathy with your view. You may be interested in knowing that one of the things I propose would grant Jewish Israelis who are either reform or conservative or non-religious, atheistic, more freedom than exists in Israel today, where the Orthodox have power in all personal status matters of Jews living in Israel. So I propose a more secular parallel system of personal status laws as a lawyer for marriage, divorce, inheritance, things like that, which right now, I think even Jewish people would tell you is oppressive because of the power of the Orthodox Jewish parties. My book, I dedicate a small chapter, a couple of pages, to why the language of two states survives, even among those who are convinced that it doesn't work. It's a very powerful language, and it stays, it continues to dominate the discussion. But in answer to your question, why didn't I, 10 years ago, say these things? I have a very specific answer. Palestinians have been told in no uncertain terms that if you speak of one state, that ends the discussion, because it means you no longer recognize Israel as a Jewish state, and it means you want to destroy Israel, which means you're probably similar to Hitler, which means there is nothing we can talk to you about. You must talk one state. You must talk two states. You must limit your discussion to what's happening in the West Bank, Gaza, and the occupied territories. Otherwise, there is no discussion with you. And I have succumbed because I thought that that was a reasonable compromise. And for many years, if I talk one state, I would not be allowed to talk. So Palestinians have been told, don't say secular democratic state. That means you want to destroy the state of Israel. That means we have nothing to talk about. Only talk two states. And it's only after, thanks to the settler movement largely and to the Israeli government, after that became no longer viable and possible, have we been liberated, basically, to speak about a one-state solution. This is the short answer to your question. A good question. Thank you, Stephen. First, I'll give you my view of nationalism. I think that nationalism, uh, under situations of oppression, colonialism, foreign rule, can be a very positive force. But then once it's realized, it can become very negative. So nationalism as an assertion of the rights of a people to have their identity and to have self-determination and to have control over their destiny can be a very positive thing. But once you achieve it, then it becomes, and then it becomes an excuse to exclude others, to claim superiority over others, to discriminate against others. Then it becomes destructive. So that is why I say Palestinian nationalism needs to morph, needs to change. Yes, it's still very important for us and for our identity and for our survival to be recognized as a people, especially when the other side is busy saying there's no such thing as Palestine, there never was, there never is, it's an invented thing. No, we assert our nationalism. But I want us to assert it not to the exclusion of others, but to also include in our definition of what Palestinian nationalism, 7 million Jews who are living in the land and who are going nowhere. It's very difficult. It's a tough pill to swallow, and it requires an ideological reorientation for Palestinians. The second question is a good one. Ordinarily, reserving positions to people on the basis of ethnicity, as was done in Lebanon, is really not a good idea. I agree with you. But I am trying to deal with a very narrow, specific phenomena that exists with Zionism. The fact is, Zionism has a great appeal to Jews because it starts out by saying, we were unsafe. We were discriminated against. That anti-Semitism is not just a passing phenomena, it's a really serious charge. We have been genocided, we have been pogromed in Russia and Poland, we have been inquisitioned in Spain, we have been Holocausted in Germany. Notice all of these things happened in Europe, didn't happen in the Middle East or in the Islamic countries, but that's another issue. Zionism comes and says, I have the answer. The answer is Jewish power. Jewish overwhelming power, that the only way we can be safe is by basically building this big, huge bastion and having more weapons, 10 times more than anybody around us, so that even if they look at us the wrong way, we will be able to smash them. That's the Zionist appeal. And for people who have just gone through the Holocaust, it's a very real appeal. Because the Holocaust has caused a trauma of unimaginable magnitude. Yes, it's been stoked by right-wing politicians and it is being sometimes artificially maintained, but it's real. It's real. The fact that you're paranoid doesn't mean that people aren't going after you. So I need to deal with that trauma. That becomes my problem now. I know most Palestinians say it's not our fault, it's not our problem. Yes, it's not our fault, but it is our problem because we are now suffering from it and we are now paying the price for it. So I'm trying to ameliorate and reduce that fear because I really don't think the state of Israel is, and the Zionist movement is in existential danger from any combination of military forces around it. It has its own arms industry that exports arms to, it's like number 6 or 7 exporting arms to the world. It has nuclear weapons. It has a military that's like huge. And second, it can project its powers and its destructive power. And most Palestinians, when I tell them, they say, what Israel's security fears? They laugh. We're the ones who are vulnerable and in danger. But that's not a helpful position to take. I'm really trying to understand and deal with this trauma and say, look, we can keep you in at least control of the top 5 positions. But we want control over police because policing the day-to-day activities, that's where we are being subjected every day. Of course, the more ideal solution would be total erasure of these distinctions. But I recognize reality. And I'm saying, okay, given that reality, here's what I am proposing. And here's why I can live with it. I will see if I can answer all of these questions within a very, very short time. The first question was about the state of Israel today. Any polls on how they think about a single state? The answer is that the population in Israel has been moving steadily towards more and more extreme right wing. I doubt that they would like the idea of a single state that is joint between Palestinians and Israelis. They'd like a single state and they like it all to be Jewish. Thank you very much. Or dominated by Jews. The last question on the right of return and how does it work out in practice. In my book, I speak about the ability of the new state to accommodate these refugees, not by supplanting those who are living on their land or in their homes, but by providing them alternative housing or compensation. There's a whole, I mean, Israel has a whole ministry that whose job was to accommodate, train, house, provide jobs for Jews from all over the world. So if there's a ministry that's dedicated to accommodating, training, housing, providing compensation and integration for Palestinians returning, that is part of what I am suggesting. And I say clearly that this helps remove the bitterness, the hatred, the sense of injustice that can be very dangerous for Jewish Israelis as well. I agree with most of your points, but I didn't think it was useful to get into the issue of whether Jews are really genetic Jews, whether ethnically they constitute a people, or whether they are just a religion. Uh, because I wanted to deal with the reality existing on the ground today. In fact, I have a friend a Palestinian friend, who went and did a DNA analysis. And he has more Ashkenazi Jewish blood in him than probably many Israeli Jews today. So I just moved beyond all that and said, look at the reality that it exists today. Can we accommodate these two people within a single state? And my answer is yes. So I wanted to concentrate most of my replies to about both about Gaza and about the whole issue of trust. On Gaza, it's very clear. You have 2 million people living in a very narrow, small, constrained area. They desperately need for that area to open up, to be allowed to deal with the rest of the world. The existing closure and siege of Gaza is totally unconscionable. They don't get enough electricity, 4 or 5 hours a day. They don't get clean water. They don't get enough food. The Israeli army actually calculates how many calories it takes for them to continue to basically survive and allow only that many trucks of food in. Plus, whatever excuse there is for preventing things coming in, what excuse is there to preventing exports, particularly of agricultural material? It's a totally domination, oppression system that siege needs to be lifted. Has no excuse whatsoever to continue. And then I want to end with this whole issue of trust. Trust is an intangible quality that often is used and as an excuse not to do anything. How can you trust me? I remember when Yasser Arafat announced that they recognize the state of Israel. At that time, Yitzhak Shamir says, this is a declaration of war. This shows that the Arabs are getting smart. And therefore, we have to be more careful towards them. I don't think there's anything people can do to generate trust. What we can do is create situations on the ground that address people's actual physical needs, and therefore hope that trust can be generated or created by itself rather than artificially used as a demand for additional steps to be created. So somebody gave some historic examples, Northern Ireland and other places. And my answer is, you really cannot change what's in people's hearts. And you cannot demand that you change what's in people's hearts. What you can do is create laws and structures that officially ban and prohibit discrimination and racism and privilege. There will always be people who are racist, but you can make it illegal for them to discriminate in employment, in privileges, in housing, and in other factors. You can feel what you want, but you're not allowed to discriminate and insist on privilege against me. This is partly what's happening in the United States and in other countries. You cannot eliminate racism by legislation. You can eliminate discrimination, particularly in the public sphere, by law and by judicial instruments that will punish and prohibit discrimination. So if you are waiting for trust to develop, now I think particularly for people who went through the Holocaust, any step that you take to build that trust can only be also a step uh, to increase the mistrust. Aha, they're getting smart. They're trying to fool us. We have to be doubly on our guard against them. So I cannot generate trust. I can only ask for specific actions to be taken that hopefully will create trust. If you allow me access to the sea where I can go, and Israel did that, by the way, a number of times. They just say, today we're going to cancel all permits. Anybody can come into. 1 million Palestinians went into Israel. They went to the sea, they went to the beaches, they went to the stores, and they returned, and nothing happened. So it is possible to do something like that. Uh, and maybe that generates trust, and maybe it doesn't. But the importance is not to create the trust, but to change the physical situation that right now is discriminatory and oppressive and should not be allowed to continue. Uh, in Gaza, especially, of all places. I think I've tried to answer all the questions.